Hello, good day, everyone. This is Launch Your Career, and today we are going to focus on developer advocate as a job role. We're exploring 24 different job roles, just all around tech in this series, and I'm very excited to introduce one of the people I really admire greatly in advocacy, and that is Thomas Lewis. Welcome, Thomas.
Thank you, and thank you for the kind words.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I'm looking forward to having a conversation with you, Thomas. So, for all of you out there, Thomas and I meet fairly regularly and we talk about all things developer advocacy and developer relations and things like that. So, today's conversation is just kind of almost a glimpse into what one-on-one might be like for Thomas and I as we explore different themes and different challenges and amazing joys that come with being a developer advocate. So, as we get into it, I want to just begin. Hey, Microsoft Reactor, we have a code of conduct. Please be kind and considerate during today's conversation. But most importantly, please share your ideas and your questions. The chat windows are open in YouTube, Twitch, and LinkedIn. And if you ask a question, we'll be sure to try to answer it either throughout the live stream or shortly after. So, with that, let's just kind of begin. I think with I call it icebreakers. We can kind of think about it, but Thomas, like you're a person who has been part of dev advocacy for I think a couple decades. If I
Yeah.
know, you've been a mentor to me for at least 10, and that. But you've been around this space for some time. So, like, what are you most passionate about right now?
Wow. There's so much going on right now, which is a wonderful thing. I'm a technologist at heart, so I'm one of those people that I love technology, and of course, there's always we've got to be very careful about new technologies, and we can probably talk about that quite a bit. The thing I'm probably most interested in is I made a change in career about 5 weeks ago, where I was a manager of managers in our cloud advocacy group, which is a part of Microsoft's developer relations. And I moved to an individual contributor role, which is usually kind of interesting because it's usually the other way around. People are like,
Uh-huh.
"Oh, I want to go up the management chain," and this is the second time I've done this because I'm just passionate about the technology, and I think there's just a point at which you go from supporting others to going, I want to do those kind of cool things. So I actually am in this kind of hybrid role, which is somewhat odd. I'm in what we call our emerging bets team, and I am on a green computing team and a spatial computing team. Now, the spatial computing, as you can kind of look around, that's probably my primary passion, and yes, I can talk about that for hours. What's been especially interesting though is the green computing because a
Mhm.
lot of folks are like, well, what does that mean? Do you go around telling people to recycle and things like that? And I'm like, no, what we're doing is we're trying to talk to technologists and primarily software engineers about how they can think about the software they build and making sure that it is, carbon efficient, that it considers the energy, energy intakes and things like that. And what's been very interesting, and this happens to me all the time, I get curious about something and go, "Oh, that should be easy," and then I find out like, "Uh-oh, it's not as easy as I thought." And green computing was the same thing. I thought it was just going to be like, "Oh yeah, like tell people to not use as much, compute, and you will emit less, carbon." But you start to get into these really big challenges of like, well, how do we measure that, right? Because some folks are like, let's measure it, by, hey, what does a computer within a data center, how much of carbon does it emit? And then some people are like, well, we actually kind of need to go back to like, how much concrete did we create, use to build
Mhm.
a data center? Because actually, concrete is one of the biggest emitters of carbon when you're building buildings and things like that. And so it's been fascinating because this thing that felt kind of like very high level is very, very technically deep. And when you talk to these folks, some people are like, hey, we need to focus more on energy, efficiency. And some people are like, we should focus on carbon efficiency. And then what we're doing is we're actually working with the Green Software Foundation to kind of come up with like, what does this look like? So they have what they call this SCI spec that kind of defines like, hey, how are we going to think about this? But it's not super detailed. So like that's the work that we're doing in the community now,
Yeah.
trying to figure out like how deep do we go, right? Because it is definitely a Alice in Wonderland rabbit hole. So I've been
Yeah.
fascinated, and it's pushing me. That's the other thing I love is like I am new to this, and so I'm the one who's like, uh, what does this three-letter acronym stand for, or why does it when you say this word, why does it what's the context of that word? So
Yeah.
that's been kind of really fascinating for me, and also getting back to sort of an IC and like what matters, and what doesn't. And so it's kind of a different method of the way that I think about things that I haven't had to think about in a long time.
Yeah. Yeah. SCI, Sustainable Computing Initiative. Did I get that right? Or is it different?
It's basically it's actually a equation, right? So it's
Okay.
looking at how much carbon you emit, how much of energy consumption that you're using, and so yeah. So if you go to Green Foundation or just do a Google Bing on it, you'll find it, and then there's a write up there that kind of explains the details and nuances of like, hey, what does the S mean? What does the C mean? What does the
Wow.
I mean? Right? And it's kind of like I don't know if you ever remember the Drake equation, right? Which was the search for extraterrestrial life, right? And it's this really long equation, and then like each piece of it you can now like go deeper and deeper into.
Yeah.
And I'm only saying that because I took a search for extraterrestrial life class at university. And by the way, this thing was hard. Like I thought we were going to watch like movies like ET and things like that. And no, no, no. We went and it was like, hey, what's the probability of a species having opposable thumbs to build tools, right? And that was like
Oh,
one little part of that Drake equation. And so this SCI spec is the same way. And software carbon initiative, right?
got it. Software Carbon Initiative. Got it. Cool. Sustainability I know is important in there, so took a guess. Also some terminology. So like when we talk about manager and individual contributor for all of you learners out there, I think that's a pretty standard industry term. Certainly Microsoft has been using for a while, but what we're referring to is a person that is in a job role where they have direct reports, right? They're managing a group of people, or a manager of managers being a person who manages managers who then in turn have directs. An individual contributor is a person in job role that doesn't have directs. They can focus specifically on the impact and on the initiatives and on the things that they do and such. And so, DevRel and developer advocacy is one of those kind of incredible roles where, at least I observe, people move between becoming managers, or they might move back to focus on a technical topic more deeply. And so, Thomas, like, I really admire you for kind of making that jump and saying, I've been a manager for many years. I want to go focus back on the technology and get really, really detailed with that. Because, that's one of the pros and cons of being a manager is sometimes you don't get a chance to go as deep. You trust your people, you give guidance, you support them. But sometimes you don't get to always think about all the cool stuff happening at the technology level, at
Yeah.
least on average, right? Most managers, I think, I'll speak for myself. Most managers have an IC part of our role, an individual contributor part, like maybe
Right.
an initiative that we focus on. For me, like last week, it was MVP Summit. I think that it differs from different roles and things like that as well.
Yeah, and no, and the thing that was great was my boss and my current boss. There's very much a focus on making sure that you are a practitioner as well, right? Because it's very easy to get kind of wrapped up in meetings and decision making and processes and things like that. And they've always been very supportive because I've had this passion again around spatial computing, and so they've always said like, "Hey, go and do that." So it's one of those things where I just got to the point where I was like, well, I want to do more of that, right? And the thing that's really wonderful about Microsoft, and people are like, hey, how can you stay at Microsoft for 24 years? And I've been surprised at it myself. And I'm like, well, Microsoft has always given you a lot of latitude to kind of do the right thing or do the thing that you're interested in, if it supports the business, right? Because that's the thing that people need to think a lot about is, hey, yeah, you might want to do something you might be passionate about, but you also have to go, okay, how's this benefit Microsoft? Because a friend of mine one time told me very abruptly that, hey, who signs your check? And it's like, oh, well, Microsoft signs my check. So I have to kind of think about that thing, and it's that nice balance of business and sort of the technology that if you can kind of get those two together, it's a really wonderful thing, and Microsoft allows for that. So it's been wonderful.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. Well, if you're curious about technology and you're interested in exploring more topics like sustainable computing, green computing, and developer advocacy in general, we do have a cloud skills challenge for this series. It's available at aka.ms/launch your career skills. The skills is the cloud skills challenge there. Basically, we've got one module for each of the 24 job roles that we are exploring in the series. And so you can try new things out. Collect all 24, or just kind of pick the ones that are most important for you to explore as a professional and aspiring developer advocate yourself. So, all right, let's get back to it, Thomas. So let's start to talk a little bit about a day in the life of a developer advocate. So first of all, like, what do you love most about this chosen discipline?
Um, I always appreciated that you never stop learning, right? And this is also too what I always tell folks when I'm hiring them in, is this is a role that it's not like, oh, I learned all this stuff and now like I'm just going to go and do it, right, for the rest of my career. It's really, it changes all the time, right? And so there's not only just the technology changing and the devices changing, but then we have these like huge platform shifts, right? So like there's the cloud, there was mobile, there was the internet, right? Even at one point, which we now just pretty much take for granted. And so I think that you're constantly thinking about like, hey, what's happening, what's new, what does this look like. It's also trying to be very thoughtful in not getting caught up in the hype of things, because I think that a lot of times, and especially with the way that news and information travels fast, there almost feels like this sense of FOMO on just about everything, right? So like if you're on Twitter today, right now it's all about blue sky, right? And oh, like if you really like Twitter, then you would love blue sky. And we're all like, I thought Mastodon was the thing that we were all like starting to go to. So we in tech we get kind of fickle about things a lot, and so I think that one of the other kind of things that you have to do in the job that's really interesting is to kind of like dig into it yourself and kind of be thoughtful in how you want to approach it,
Mhm.
and then what you will sort of stick with, and what are things that you're just like, oh, that's good to know, but I'll leave it over there, because you can't know it all, right? And so that's why I love the concept. Satya Nadella, our CEO, in his book that he wrote, he talked about hey, wanting to create a learn it all organization, which I
Mhm.
really respect, because back in the olden days, I used to be around execs and stuff who, if you didn't know some very esoteric thing of your business, there was a message that would go to your boss and he'd be like, oh, they didn't show up very well in this meeting, right? For this very esoteric question. And now what happens is there's more of a, oh, get back to me, on that, and
Mhm.
that'll be perfectly fine. And that you just can't know everything, right? Like
Yeah,
that's
that's
the
true.
hardest part. We used to be able to be like, hey, if you know these three things, you kind of know Microsoft's developer business. And now, I mean, there's parts of, even Azure, right, that I'm just like, I have no clue that, it does that. But then at the same time, it's fun to find those things like Azure Space. I'm not a
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
not a official advocate for Azure Space, but a lot of folks, because I'm always talking about it on social, people are like, how can I get on your Azure Space team? And I'm like, I wish I could tell you, but I'm not on that team. But there's those kind of fun, amazing things. And so again, that passion of learning it all is what I really, really love. And there's just this, not this, there's an expectation that you'll learn quickly, but there's also just the expectation of like, yeah, there's no way to know everything that's going on. And I think that also makes it very helpful in a technologist journey, because we're at the new things as well, right? And we love to share those things. And so if people are new, like I was talking about green software, um, you know, there are people out there who are going to be like, I'm trying to get into this and I don't understand it, right? So I'm kind of looking at myself as, hey, I'm going to forage through and then I'm going to talk about it to make it easier to understand. Of like, oh,
Yeah.
why do we care about the software carbon intensity spec, right? Why does that matter? Right. And so those are the kinds of things that I just love doing, because at the end of the day, I love sharing. And I think that's a trait of someone in advocacy. One, they love to learn, and then they love to share, right?
Yeah.
And we're oversharers, even though me personally, I'm an introvert. But yeah, when it's something that I'm passionate about, I love to talk about it and share it.
Yeah, wonderful. And Ifioma, I see you out there. We'll make sure we get to your question there. That's going to be a really key theme on it. But in the meantime, Thomas, there's a couple of themes that I think you touched on there that really resonate with me as a developer advocate and as a person who's worked in this space as well. The first one is being a learn-it-all. I think that one of the things that makes advocacy such an amazing profession or subdiscipline of tech is that you do get to constantly learn and try new things. Some different professional coaches or mentors that I've had will talk about your career as kind of a dimension of range and depth, right? You can get into
Mhm.
a very, very technically deep area. And you can have a lot of range. You can have a lot of openness to experiences, a range of different things and experiences that you have that kind of make you who you are as a professional. I'll cut to the chase and say usually a combination of a little both is a good thing. But DevRel especially is one of those things that kind of naturally expands your range. Because you have these conversations with new engineers, new products, excuse me, with engineers that are building things that are cutting edge, and you get to be kind of part of the new wave of innovation in that.
Yeah.
And as you said, sometimes we can be a little fickle and kind of chase the new hypey thing too. And so part of DevRel is also sorting what's truly valuable, I think, from what's exploratory or experimental or is being proven out and things like that too.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. So, no, I love that theme. The other thing I just love about advocacy in general is like I love the creative elements of it. Building
Yeah.
demos and trying new things. And I've always been in admiration of some of kind of the new, demos or things that you come out with. Like say, green software is a great example of that.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things. What because about every 5 years, I go looking around, right, and like,
Mhm.
oh, maybe I want to be a PM in a team, or I want to go off and do this. And it's been very hard to kind of get out of advocacy, because I have enjoyed the sort of a little the framework for how to do it. Is can be pretty solid,
Mhm.
but the approach that you take can be different, right? So it's like, hey, do we build an amazing demo? Do we think about documentation
Yeah.
in a different way? And that's what's kind of nice, and especially like on the spatial side, I'm talking to my boss now, and we're trying to come up with ideas of like, hey, how do we think about students, for example, and what do we go in off and do there, right? What are the kind of the seeds that we need to sow on the green software side of things, because that is definitely emerging space. And we're like, hey, we know that there's going to be green software engineers as a role out there, so like how do we help to kind of build and support those kinds of things.
Yeah, totally. Well, you talked earlier a little bit about green software. Maybe as an advocate, can you tell us a little bit more about where you think Spatial is going, and what are you doing with Spatial nowadays?
Yeah, so spatial's kind of interesting, because I think as we have kind of hype around AI today, we had hype around sort of the metaverse last year, right? So like,
Mhm.
2022, I think, was like the year of the metaverse. And what has happened now that AI has kind of come in, it's funny because some people have the kind of the cynical approach as there are in tech, which is like, oh, this metaverse, yeah, we're done for. No one's thinking about that anymore. And I'm like, well, there's a lot of us working in this
We
space.
are.
And
We
if
are.
you're, yeah, and if you're in the space, you're like, we were here before the hype. We will be here after the hype. And in my opinion, the best thing is when the hype is focused somewhere else, it actually helps you, right? Because number one, you can go get your job done.
Yeah.
Number two, people become more realistic, right? Because you've gone through the hype cycle. You're now sort of in the trial of disillusionment. If you believe the hype cycle, the way that it
Yeah.
works. There's is VR dead, right? Is the metaverse dead? There's all these, demises, right? And for those of us who are sort of in this spatial space, we've always believed that, like, hey, the metaverse wasn't a destination, but it was more of a conceptual north star that we were wanting to go to. And what was going to happen is it was going to be a longer journey, because what we're trying to do in this space, I mean, it's pretty revolutionary, right? When you start to kind of dig into these devices that like are around me, and you go, okay, like, I have to beam a laser into someone's eye. You can't have a backlog of bugs around that, right? It's like, no,
Yeah.
if you're just
It's
point
got to
laser,
work.
guys,
Yeah.
it's got to work, and it's got to be like solid. The other thing is that we're literally trying to push up against physics, right? In the things that we're doing in this space. And so a lot of us, we're looking at it going, this is a wonderful thing, and it's going to just continue to grow and grow. But the reality is this is hard to solve, right? We can't
Yeah.
just throw GPUs at it and like, oh, now it makes everything better. It's the canonical, hey, this thing has to feel good on my head. It has to make me not feel sick, right? And we've gotten way better about that, but there's still issues around that. There is the, hey, how do we build these wonderful immersive experiences, right? Because those are not easy to do, right? And it's getting better and easier
Yeah.
and more approachable. And that's kind of where my passion is democratizing this, AR and VR in this space. And I do, and I think we've still got time to go. And then also too, we need to sort of moderate how we think of what is successful. Um, I'm pretty much of a moderate kind of person. And it's kind of funny because when you're sort of in the middle of things, people are never happy with you, right? So what I have said is, I think that the AR VR space is going to be successful like the Apple Watch, right?
Mhm.
Where but it was funny because when the Apple Watch first came out, people thought, "Oh, well, don't I get rid of like my cell phone? Don't I get rid of all these things and I just walk around with this as my computer?" And I remember just thinking, I'm like,
Yeah.
that makes no sense why you would do that. So what happened was it became successful in its own right, right? We
Yeah.
found what it was good for. It was to augment the things you do. So people were like, "Hey, I use it for notifications, or I use it for my health training and things like that." And that's what I've said is I'm like, hey, I think AR VR is going to be very successful because as a watch, in the watch industry, this thing blows away all the other things, right? And that's something that no one really knows about. And so I have always said, I'm like, we're going to be kind of like the Apple Watch. But it's funny because people who are like super hyped around AR VR technology, they're like, you're short selling it, right? And then the people who on the other side of the spectrum are like, you're just a shill for the AR VR space. And I'm like, well, and what I have found in my career is when there is that kind of flux of like people being on both sides and not necessarily agreeing with me, that usually means I'm pretty much on the right path. So I'm hoping that this bet has definitely will pay off, but it's something that's going to take some time. And that's again why, for example, we have it as a part of our emerging bets team, because it's not foundationally sort of everyone using it like JavaScript, Python, modern ops, and things like that.
Yeah.
It's going to take some time, and there's some work we have to do. Right, we're in this. We're still in an awareness phase. I think one of the challenges that a lot of times Microsoft has is we have a sort of a "we will build it and they will come" philosophy, and that's not how it is anymore. Like we now it's hard. Developers and technologists, their attention is drawn in so many ways, and so we have to kind of cut through all of that. And it's like, hey, how do we figure out how to do that, and that it just doesn't look like yet another hyped up thing that will go away, in 6 months, and now we'll have something new to be hyped up about.
Yeah. Yeah, and I bring it up not only because I think it's fascinating that, you said last year the metaverse, this year generative AI and the promise of AI. But as from a career dimension, that's what I think we deal with as developer advocates is we're on that sort of cutting edge. And so oftentimes from a career perspective, we're in a position to listen to customer feedback for the first time. And so a new device comes out, a new VR device or AR device or something like that comes out, and we're on that kind of that front customer experience where we're hearing that feedback. And one of the roles of advocacy is totally bringing that product feedback back to
Yeah.
engineering and helping them find success and understanding how to harden the product. And maybe like you say in the form factors of AR VR, how do we get to where it's a little bit more than glasses or a form factor of being able to wear something for a long period of time. That's one of the heroes. And I think DevRel and Dev Relations helps our product engineers think about those and really answer that sort of feedback and design the products in that way. Super fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. You also brought up an interesting secondary theme of like this feels like the year of generative AI or certainly Chat GPT and other forms of AI technology really exploded in popularity. 1 million to 10 million to 100 million views quickly, I think was the numbers that I heard. There's a lot of hype and discussion about it, and so this is also an opportunity and a new challenge for DevRel because it's like how do you start to listen to that feedback and how do you prepare this technology for a large amount of people that may use it in different ways? And I liked your word assistive, right? Just like the Apple Watch or the Metaverse is assistive, I think AI technologies are assistive. They can be in service to us to help make us more creative or product productive and things like that. So, yeah, and DevRel, where do you think the rise of generative AI is going? What opportunities does DevRel have there?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I think will hit, because in DevRel there's sort of three things that we do, right? So there's community, getting feedback to the product teams, and then content. I think content is going to be a very big thing, right? Because a lot of what the developer relations teams do is content in one way or another, right? And it might be documentation, it might be blog posts, it might be going and presenting at a conference. And so I think what we're going to start to see is that, the people are going to be able to sort of prompt these conversations with generative AI to say, hey, talk to me about this very complex topic in a very simple way so that I can understand it, right? On YouTube, there's these series of videos that I see that I absolutely love where they get an expert and the expert has to talk about it in 5 different ways. So they'll start with explain quantum physics to a 5-year-old, right? And then so explain quantum physics to a 65-year-old. And when I see those, I'm like, oh my gosh, that is the advocacy job because we talk about things related to who we're talking to. And so it's not unusual that you might talk in one day to a CEO of a big company. You might be talking to the head of development at a startup, and you might be talking to a student that reached out to you on LinkedIn, all in the same day, talking about these things, but maybe in a very different way. And so I think content is where we're gonna see definitely an impact there. And then I think the other thing that we're going to start to try to figure out is, again, how does it augment things? I mean, anytime we have automation, which if we think of things like this, it is somewhat automation.
Yeah.
We do lose jobs, and I think that that's always the sort of like two big um, media hype things that happen when you get technologies like this, right? Like, oh, these things, every day we see, oh, here's the 7 jobs that Chat GPT will take away. I don't necessarily agree. It will happen to some extent, right? But
Mhm.
it's not sort of this perfect, like, oh, now we just have these robots that we send in to do your work for you, right? It's like, wow, that's not going to happen. But the thing is that it is going to make us more productive, right? Like, so for example, if I'm writing a document internally and I want to talk about, hey, what's the SWOT analysis of one of our competitors? I don't start from scratch, right? I can kind of go, oh, well, ChatGPT, give me a SWOT analysis of what you see, for this. But it's still going to take people who are going to have to check to make sure that it's correct, because right now these things are just language models, right? And what it does is it says, okay, you gave me some words, and then what do I think the next words are going to be? And
Yeah.
so that's why we have, when people talk about like, oh, it's hallucinating or this, I disregard it. Like anyone who wants to try to put human characteristics to AI. I'm like, no, 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 that's in the movies, and we love those movies. I personally love those kind of movies. But at the end of the day, there is going to need to be that human element. And if someone is saying, well, there's no need for that human element, right there, that's when sirens go off in my head. They're like, oh, we probably haven't thought about this very well,
Yeah.
because if we look at it, and the thing what I love about Microsoft is we have these responsible AI principles. And one of those design principles is that these things are meant to augment people. They're not meant to remove people, right? So if someone came to me and said, hey, how can we remove, this, job function and just use Chat GPT in its place? I'd be like, okay, that the premise of that question is wrong, and I wouldn't even support it, right? And
Yeah.
and my management is good enough where they would support me and go, yeah, we're not going to do that. That's not, we're being responsible. So I think that, will it affect developer relations? Absolutely, right? Because now some people are thinking about like, well, what does documentation look like, right, in
Yeah.
this sort of world? What is the expectations there? But too, there's going to be different things, right, for different people. So some people, for example, technologists, they want docs, right? Like they want the old traditional docs, and if they could have it in a book format, they would like it there. There's
Yeah.
younger audiences that they're like, is it on YouTube, right? Like when I deal with students, if I'm like, go check out our docs, it's kind of like, okay, and if I go, oh, we got a YouTube video that shows how to do it,
You're like,
immediately
"Ah."
everyone's
Yeah.
got it, already up on their screen. So I think that we will find this thing to be helpful. Now, the hard part is with all the hype that comes about with it and all sort of the nihilism. And guess what? I'm Gen X, and I'm slightly nihilistic in my thinking at times. But I think that what happens is that the media needs to like get people excited. So if you say AI is taking over the world because it now is able to be a chess master, um, you kind of get both sides, right? People who are like, no, that's not true, right? And they'll go click on it, and then the people who are like, oh my gosh, this the world's falling apart and AI is going to take over. That's true too. And I'm like, it's the click, right? It's the
Yeah.
click that those folks want. So I think that is it going to be important to DevRel? Absolutely. And we're looking at all different parts of like, how do we talk about it, right? And like, how do we create consistency, right? So if I show you a cool prompt to build out like a Babylon JS, website for an immersive experience, when you type in that prompt, will you get the same thing or
Yeah.
not? Right. And so there's all those things that we need to think about. And like I said, is it the best? Right. So then I might put my green hat on and I go, okay, when ChatGPT says to go build this in this way, is it building it in the most efficiently green way, or is it even thinking about that, right? So
Yeah.
then we get into like, well, how can I inject a bit of that quote unquote greenness into it? Or hey, we don't just allow developers to build however they want, but can you put something in there where it says, hey, this is how we build things and these are our templates and stuff, and then yeah, it can go and build that out. So things will get more productive. And we have to remember, when computers came about, there were different folks out there saying, oh my gosh, we're only going to work three days a week because computers are going to make things so much faster. And I think we got that wrong, right? It was like, no, no, no. Now we can get even more done, right? And I think that's probably what's going to happen, that we need to really consider like, hey, it's not just that this thing's going to create something for us, but we're going to also have to take the time to measure like, hey, when it said go check this out, is that a good data point to use or not, right? Or
Yeah.
did it kind of go off based on just what someone said in a blog post somewhere, right? And that gets into the, how is it being trained and all those kinds of things.
Yeah, yeah. And I tend to think of it as I believe that assistive AI will help us think more creatively and spend more of our finite cycles on creativity and thinking about what's next in that. And so, it's indeed, to put a career dimension on it, right? I think it's going to be a key thing for DevRel because we're in the business of teaching and sharing, demystifying technology, and so it's about skilling, right? And so one of the things is as these assistive AI solutions come to market, like ChatGPT and such, we're going to have to train people how to utilize this in the most effective way in service for humanity. And I do believe that innovation will help drive our productivity. GitHub Copilot is a great example of that.
Yeah.
The incredible ability to generate code or to generate referenceable code or commented code that makes it easier for other developers to understand what you're building and such. Good example. I think it's just the tip of the iceberg for what the potential is, but it's exciting to kind of think about that. And not a lot different than say like a JavaScript library or framework. You used to have to write JavaScript from scratch, and now you can pull in these amazing libraries that do a lot of the heavy lifting or the physics for you. Babylon JS is a great example of that for 3D. And so to me, this kind of takes that next step and says this is kind of the prefabricated or the suggested elements, but you have to be the human in control of it, saying, this is what I want to do with this. This is what I don't want. And to your point, is it green? Probably it has an opportunity to be a little greener in the future as engineers think about that, right?
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, and the technology has been abstraction, right? Like we used to think about like, oh, I got to write to the registers, right? And it's binary code, ones zeros, right? People are writing assembly language, and as far as I know, I don't know anyone who writes assembly language today. There's not need, but guess what? There's probably people who are down at the the silicon level that have to think about those
Yeah.
types of things. But yeah, we've always had abstractions, and we're gonna have more of them, right? And I think that you know the more that we understand and the more that we can have these conversations, right? It's better, because I think that a lot of folks are, what they worry about is, well, my manager is going to like read this article and then think like there's no need to have like a developer. And I'm like, well, that's where you're gonna have to like what you heard the term manage up, right? And you're gonna have to say like, hey, here's how this works, right? And so if people think that like, oh well, we'll just get rid of everybody and we'll just have AIs doing these things, I'm like, there might be some things that you're going to be able to do that, but not necessarily all the things.
Yeah.
At least not now. And my hope is it just keeps growing and growing. And if it turns out where it's like, hey, Thomas, we don't need you because building a spatial application, is like just but good prompt engineering. And I'm like, well, guess what? I'm going to do that. I'm going to learn about good prompt engineering
Yeah. Yeah.
to build these kinds of things, and we'll abstract it out. And guess what? There's always going to be challenges, right? Because someone's going to be like, "Hey, it's cool you built this, spatial, VR app, but now I wanted to integrate with X, right?" And so
Yeah.
that's where you're the value add that you're going to have there. But yeah, if and
Yeah.
this is with anything. If you think that your job is not going to change and it's going to stay the same forever, that I'm highly surprised at it. I'm sure that even if we opened up a bookstore, right, we would have sort of like what we think opening up a bookstore would be. But if you talk to bookstore folks, they'd be like, "Oh, yeah, that is how we did it in the the '90s. Here's the bookstore management today," and they'd be like, "Oh, okay." So again,
Yeah.
we have to be learn it alls.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And that's the business of developer relations, right?
Yeah.
I can hear 5 years from now, Thomas Lewis, prompt engineer. It's the new branch of developer relations that you're leading or thinking about, or
Right.
green prompt engineer job
By the
role.
way, already thinking about that. Like
Yeah, no,
that's been digging into that, trying to figure out like, okay, what does that mean? Pairing those two things
yeah.
together.
And I think therein lies our thesis for this episode, right? Always keep learning. Developer relations and being a dev advocate is always about kind of being in front of this stuff and really thinking about it and thinking about where the market is going to go and what people need. Um, you know, I heard a stat recently, and I'll paraphrase it since I can't remember the numbers directly off the top of my head, but it is something to the effect of there are far more apps in the world that need to get created in the next 20 years than there are developers. And so we're
Mhm.
going to need prompt engineers. We're going to need domain experts who know their data sets to really help create the best out of large language models and things like that. And to your point, like we need to build green engineering into the large language model in the first place. That might be an area in the next iteration to train, and that requires base data to do that right, and such. So all right, let's go to a question. So Ifeoma has been asked this question, I think, a long time ago, but I wanted to get to it too. So where is this all going? So Thomas, what advice would you have for a person who really wants to get into DevRel? So Ifeoma, for example, has been, a software engineer for 2 years, been in tech events and speaking. Where do you think the sweet spot is for entering DevRel, and what do you look for as a hiring manager?
Yeah, so having done some of this work for 2 years, as they say, this is putting them in a good spot. So most folks who are hiring for DevRel, they want to see a little bit of industry experience, and so that's why it's kind of hard. Even though I've hired people straight out of university into DevRel roles, it's a bit hard because you need to sort of understand developers and communities and how they work. And so, and you can teach that, but there's also just kind of like, again, getting in there, right? It's the experience of actually building something versus talking about building something. The thing is that, definitely share that out. So a lot of times, when I'm hiring, you know, and I tell this to students all the time. I'm not going to find you in your apartment, right? I'm not going to find you, in your dorm room, right? It's going to be online that I'm going to find these things. And so I've always said, share those things, and even if you're not an expert, right, you can go ahead and share those out because I think there's this feeling of like, oh, to be in developer relations, I have to be like the, the expert, and I'm like, hey, listen. I've never claimed to be the expert in anything. I'm just passionate in an area and I want to know how I best can kind of support those efforts. So I always say make sure that you're sharing and learning in public. That helps. Talk to people, let them know, right? Like, with me, if someone reaches out to me in LinkedIn and says, hey, I heard you talk about this. I just would love to like have you think of me or at least put me on your list because I have a nice little place that I put everyone who reaches out to me and says, hey, here's my resume and the kind of things I want to do. And then when a new role comes up, I go back and I look and go, okay, who are those folks? Talk about that. And then also too, like developer relations, there's a ton of great newsletters that are out there now just for developer relations. And I tell people all the time, like get into those and kind of see like what are people talking about, what are people definitely thinking about, because the other part of it is understanding like developer relations is huge, right? I think, and you just put up the developer advocate iceberg, which I love. Wasim on my team, on my bigger team, he put this together, and I'm like, oh my gosh, there is so much truth to this particular slide because people do see. Oh, you're doing public contributions. You're on social media. You're traveling and doing events. And the reason why there's a lot of folks who think it's just that is because developer advocacy is usually being the feet on the street and being the face of a company, right? But it's when you start to look at this iceberg below that you see like, oh, there's all of these other things. And so when you come into this job, It's a bit hard because there's not sort of a, oh, if I only know these three things, I'll get 80% of the interview. There's a lot of like, hey, how do you contribute? How do you feel about documentation? Like, for example, if you want a little scoop on me, I will always ask about how you feel about documentation in an interview. If
Hmm.
you are like, documentation, I don't like it, I don't like contributing to it, we're kind of done, because all the surveys show developers and technologists, documentation is either the number one or number two. The quality SDK is, might switch out between those two. But I won't hire someone who is like, I don't want to touch documentation, because I'm like, well, then that means you probably aren't in service of technologists, right? Because if technologists are saying this is the most important thing, and you're like, yeah, I don't care about that, then
Yeah.
there's a problem there. So yeah, the thing that I think folks need to do is to kind of think about that. Also, too, especially if you're going into management, in DevRel, you need to think about the business of it. And I'm gonna recommend a book, and I literally keep it here on my desk all the time. People on my teams have all been kind of tired of me always shilling this book. I get no money for it, by the way, but it's called Developer Relations: How to Build and Grow a Successful Developer Program. And the reason why I loved this book was because they did not treat DevRel as this sort of, ethereal, well, you can't quantify what we do to the business. The business just needs to understand how valuable DevRel is, just by its sheer brilliance. And like, there's nothing that will have me turn off a podcast quicker than someone saying, well, yeah, you can't quantify DevRel, because the way this book reads, number one, is they're like, you absolutely have to quantify DevRel. And you have to use the vernacular and language of the people who are paying for the program. Because
So
if
true.
you Yeah, because if you talk about things that just they don't understand, they're just gonna be like, "What is this group that I've been paying into?" And the reality is, and I do this all the time, when someone says, "Hey, we just built out a DevRel group at this company," I put a 1 year and a 2 year thing on my calendar just to go check on them, because the first year is your honeymoon phase, right? So you kind of get to do whatever you want. Second year, someone has to sit in front of a CTO or a CEO and go, okay, I put $3 million into this program. What have I gotten out of it? And
Mhm.
if you say, well, we gave out koozies and t-shirts and stuff, they're gonna be like, wait a minute, I spent 3 million on what? Right? So you have to think about the business side of it as well. And so this is where I think a lot of folks, and because developer advocates, a lot of times they come from doing it as a hobbyist. And I'm not I'm not saying that being a hobbyist is like less than professional. It just means that, like, hey, you're not usually getting paid for it. And most of us came into this role because we were doing this on our own. And someone was like, I will pay you to do the things that you are doing outside of your day job. Right. And that's how I got at Microsoft, where I was like, wait a minute. You want me to go talk to developers? You want me to reach out to them? You want me to build like the things I'm doing now, but I'm not getting paid for it? That's awesome. You come in. But when you start doing it professionally, there's a business component to it.
Yeah.
And so you have to be prepared to be able to talk about that and say, like, hey, what is the business value? Because at the end of the day, for me, for example, I tell all my folks, I'm like, we can talk about it very ethereally and, like, very dogmatically and things like that. But at the day, we want people adopting our platform, right?
Yeah.
Or adopting into the communities that we support. And that's the thing that you have to think about when you're going into these interviews as well, is like, hey, how do I talk about it? So it's not just like the deeply technical stuff, because to be quite honest, I can teach you the deep technical stuff, or I can view, your stuff that you're sharing, and I can go, okay, this is the technical level this person is at. But how do they think about these things? Because, like you alluded to earlier, we do a lot of different things, right? We're not sort of like, oh, sales sells, development develops the product, right? We're in this weird place, and it's a great place to be, because we can help people a lot, because developers and technologists tend to have specialized needs, or I need to talk to a certain person, right? And we're good at kind of being that person or finding that person, because again, we think about things very holistically. So when we go to a product team, for example, we talk about like, hey, this is what
Yeah.
the community is looking at and needs, and it's not in this very defined niche. And so yeah, so I would tell people, like, one, if you can, get that book. Two, go subscribe to developer relations newsletters and really start to understand, like, what does it mean to build a community, what does it mean to work with your product teams. Learn in public, right? The most you can. Now, some folks, unfortunately, they're not able to share everything because they get the brunt of things. But I tell people, like, you don't have to turn on comments. Like, I think a lot of people feel like, well, if I'm going to show someone how I did something, I got to turn on the comments. And I'm like, no, you don't have to do that. If
Yeah.
you're finding yourself, and especially underrepresented folks, they get way more abused online and bullied online than someone like myself. And so I'm always like, be careful, right? So if sharing is something that it makes you worry about your own personal security, then let's figure out something else. But yeah, if you can just share, and even if it's something that you're just learning, because I think a lot of people, again, think they have to be an expert to share that information. And no, you learning it is sometimes even better, because for some of us folks who may have been doing it for a long time, we've lost that, right? We know what all the vernacular is, we know all the acronyms, and then it's nice to see someone who's like, yeah, there was this weird term, and I don't know what that means, right? And so it's like, oh, well, maybe in our documentation, we need to do a better job of
Yeah.
presenting that.
Yeah. Yeah, gosh, Thomas, you touched on so many amazing dimensions, so many places I could take that. I wish I had a whole nother hour, but I'll summarize a couple things that I took away if it's helpful for all you learners out there. One is I agree. I think you touched on one of the biggest challenges of DevRel, which is measurement and how you work with business leaders and how you demonstrate value. I believe that that's probably one of the hardest, maybe the hardest thing about a career in developer relations. And so, if you're aspiring to this role, you got to be prepared to advocate for yourself and to advocate for DevRel in general, and to frame and to compromise and to collaborate with business leaders in demonstrating what's the right balance between what the needs of the community has and what are the needs of the business and the products or services that you're advocating for ultimately.
Mhm.
Like, I think ultimately, if I could take my 10, 15 plus years in this space, it comes from a place of engagement and adoption. Those tend to be the two things
Right.
that people come back to, right? You've got an API and you're trying to get developers to use that API because your company makes money on the API or drives cloud consumption, right? That is the business objective, and so you can. As a DevRel person, you can share that in many different ways that are helpful for the end developer. But in the end of the day, you are trying to drive that or engagement, right? Just look at YouTube. Look at this show, for example. Like, I'm very transparent about it, right? We, Microsoft, are on YouTube because we believe that we want to skill people for the technologies of tomorrow. In route to that, we hope that you'll discover Microsoft technologies as an inclusive part of that. That's why I do this show, other than the
Yeah.
fact that I like hanging out with great technologists and talking about it. But that's my business objective, right? Is that I want you all to go out to our Microsoft Learn platform and other learning platforms and skill up. That's what it's about, and I
Yeah.
think it's good to be transparent about that and authentic to it.
Well, and you had the right word that was in my brain just now. Authentic. If you approach it in an authentic way, technologists will appreciate it. Like, there's sometimes this weirdness of like, well, we can't, we can't let them know that, like, we want them to use our technology, right? And
Yeah.
I'm like, wait a minute,
No,
what?
no,
Like, that's exactly what we want. And they know these are super smart people. But
yeah,
what they're saying is like, don't give me just marketing. Don't give me,
yeah,
be more productive. They're like, no, you tell me, how am I going to be more productive? And do you have any, case studies that show how productive someone has been? And, and we want to know the how, right? Like, that's the other thing. Technologists are notorious for, how does this thing work, right? Like, a lot of the reality TV shows I watch are because I'm fascinated. I'm like, cool, I don't know how a restaurant works. I want to know how a restaurant
Yeah.
works. Or, hey, we're going to build this bridge over this really tumultuous terrain. And it's like, yeah, how do you do that? Right. Like how do these things get built? And so I think if you're authentic about it, people will understand it, and you're not coming in going, hey, what technology can I get you in today? Get you in and, you can drive it off the lot.
Yeah.
That's not how we think. What we think about is like, hey, you're new to this, so we need to give you an awareness of this, and we
Yeah.
do. We hope you use it. Now the wonderful thing about DevRel is we typically don't have any kind of revenue goals, which I really respect and appreciate, and I always push back on revenue goals because I think that number one, that's not what I think developer relations should be doing. Number two, that is one part of the technologist's journey, right? Like the hey, I'm going to pay to do something. I'm like, that's this part of the spectrum, but up to that point, there's many other things we have to do, like awareness and learning and things like that, and that's the developer relations sweet spot in my
Yeah.
opinion, and that's where I'm like, we should focus most on.
Yeah, I agree, and I believe this sincerely. That's one of the reasons why I've been part of DevRel for so long. Is that if we help developers be successful, yeah, through skilling, through sharing our technologies and things like that, if we make them, if make you all out there successful, we Microsoft will be successful in turn. That is, I think, the mutual value exchange that I believe in. So we don't carry sales quotas. To your point, in this job role, we think about solutions and solving problems, and I love being in the business of that, if you want to call it that.
Yeah.
So I'm going to finish our stream with Miss Electric 88's question, which is probably the number one question I get the most in DevRel. How would you
Yeah.
advise your team on avoiding imposter syndrome? Thomas, what's your thoughts on this one?
um I always say, if you feel that you have imposter syndrome, you're in the right place. Um, you should feel comfortable to surround yourself by people who know way more than you do. I have a best friend that they're super super smart, and when they say, "Hey, I'm looking into this thing," it's one of those things where I go, "Oh, I better go look," because if by the time they've talked to me about it, they've done the due diligence. You're always going to feel like an imposter. I feel like a 24-year imposter at Microsoft all the time. But the way that I think about it is more about, you know, do you know everything? And you can't know everything, right? So what you do is you lean on others who have that expertise. And by the way, you're going to have expertise in some things that they don't have expertise in. So if you're feeling imposter syndrome, that's a good thing. Where I think that it's negative is where you are trying to show a facade of, oh, I know everything, and
Yeah.
then, in the background, you're like, oh my gosh, I know nothing. One of the things that helped me out amazingly in my career was that moment where I said, you know what? I'm going to stop trying to act like I know everything. And and there was pressure within Microsoft because that was back in the olden days of of kind of the high pressured work environment we had. And what I did is I said, I'm going to be the person who asked the questions, like, hey, you just said that 3-letter acronym, what does that mean? I'm going to ask the naive questions, because what I found was everybody else had those same questions, they just felt uncomfortable saying those. And so I said, hey, in my role, I can start being that kind of person. And by the way, if someone wants to say, well, Thomas isn't the expert that we thought he was, well, okay, fine, right? What am I going to do about that? And I'm fortunately in a position where that doesn't matter. Now, for folks again who are underrepresented, there's a bit more of a nuance there that we have to kind of think through, because there's a higher level of expectation on those folks, which is rather unfair. But yeah, you should have imposter syndrome because you want to do better. You want to know, you want to learn all the things. And so I always say that, don't view it from the perspective of it's a bad thing. Use it from the perspective of you want to do good. And one of the things that I remember, a speech coach for one of our events said to me, because I was like, why is it that like even a decade in of doing presentations to like crowds of 500, 1000, why do I still get nervous even if I'm talking to 5 people? And he said, because you want to do good.
Yeah. Yeah.
He goes, I want you to be a little nervous because that tells me you care about this. You want to
Yeah.
do well. He said, what you don't want to do is to where it's so overwhelming that it makes you fearful and you're like crumbling on stage, or you're talking in this very soft tone that no one can hear and you're very
Yeah.
monotone, or you're speaking 1,000 miles, an hour.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So very true. So be yourself out there. I think that's been a theme of our Launch Your Career series. DevRel is no different, but be your authentic self. And DevRel is always going to make you a little uncomfortable with technology because you're always going to be moving to kind of what's next. And so imposter syndrome is a natural part of it. And so speak openly about it. Talk to mentors, talk to other people about what you're feeling, and get support and find ways for experts to help you with something. And speaking of that, I think I'll end this session just by thanking you, Thomas. You've been a mentor to me for I think over 10 years, something like that as well. And you've helped me overcome imposter syndrome in a profession as I was new to it. So I want to thank you for that. That makes a real difference.
I appreciate
So
it.
you bet, you bet. So thank you today for being our guest. Really appreciate it. And for all of you out there who are learning today, please share your voice in the chat window. We're going to have another episode later today where we'll air the pre-record. You will be available for live chat Q&A and get a little deeper if you like that as well. And then finally, if you want to check out more episodes, we're at aka.ms/launchyourcareer. So thank you all. Have a great day and really appreciate you being part of our discussion. Cheers.
Bye, everyone.